Right now, Iran is more isolated than it has been since the 1979 revolution, and the numbers from 2025 tell a devastating story. Israel's October 2024 air campaign alone neutralized over two-thirds of Iran's long-range missile launchers, exposing just how vulnerable Tehran had become. Proxy funding has sharply declined due to sanctions and regional strains. Key alliance meetings haven't happened in over 8 months. Even Russia and China, Iran's supposed strategic partners, are keeping their distance. What started as a calculated geopolitical strategy has become a masterclass in how rapidly decades of relationship building can collapse when the foundation proves weaker than anyone imagined. The proxy network that was supposed to last forever. Iran's grand design rested on a network of armed allies that Tehran believed would never abandon their patron. For over 4 decades, Iran built what it considered an unbreakable system of regional influence. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. Tehran would fund, arm, and train militant groups across the Middle East, creating a network of allies that could strike at Iran's enemies from multiple directions simultaneously. This wasn't just about having friends in the region. This was Iran's insurance policy against annihilation. The financial commitment was staggering. Iran spent hundreds of millions each year to arm and train proxies from Gaza to Yemen. These weren't charitable donations. Every dollar came with expectations. The military hardware flowing through these channels told the real story of Iran's ambitions. Hamas alone launched over 10,000 rockets during the October 7th attacks, demonstrating the scale of weapons Iran had provided. Hezbollah accumulated an arsenal that rivaled some national armies, with an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel. The Houthis gained access to drone technology and anti-ship missiles that could threaten global shipping lanes. Iranian advisors embedded with these groups, providing tactical expertise and ensuring operational coordination. The Revolutionary Guard's Quds force maintained direct communication lines with commanders across the network. Iran's strategic logic was brutally simple. If Tehran faced a direct military threat, particularly from Israel or the United States, the proxy network would activate like a distributed defense system. Hamas would unleash hell from Gaza in the south. Hezbollah would rain missiles down from Lebanon in the north. The Houthis would shut down Red Sea shipping from the west. No enemy could handle simultaneous attacks from multiple directions while also trying to strike Iran directly. Each proxy group served a specific function in this grand design. The entire system was designed to make attacking Iran prohibitively expensive. But this network represented far more than military coordination. Iran treated proxy relationships as the foundation of its entire regional security architecture. These groups provided Iran with plausible deniability for attacks against its enemies while extending Tehran's strategic reach far beyond its borders. They offered early warning systems, intelligence gathering capabilities, and the ability to respond to threats without directly risking Iranian territory or personnel. Most importantly, they served as Iran's primary deterrent against regime change efforts. The proxy strategy also addressed Iran's fundamental geographic vulnerability. Surrounded by hostile neighbors and facing potential naval blockades, Iran needed external pressure valves. The proxy network created multiple fronts where Iran could apply pressure against enemies while avoiding direct confrontation. It was asymmetric warfare on a regional scale, allowing a relatively isolated Iran to punch far above its military weight. Tehran invested decades building personal relationships with proxy leadership. Iranian commanders attended weddings, funerals, and religious ceremonies with their counterparts across the network. They shared intelligence, coordinated training programs, and developed joint operational plans. These weren't transactional relationships, but carefully cultivated partnerships that Iran believed would endure through any crisis. The Revolutionary Guard treated proxy leaders as extended family members, complete with the loyalty such relationships implied. The system also created multiple layers of redundancy. If one proxy group faced internal problems or external pressure, others could compensate. Iran never expected to lose all its proxies simultaneously because the network was specifically designed to prevent such catastrophic failure. Financial flows supported more than just military operations. Iran funded hospitals, schools, and social services in areas controlled by proxy groups. This created popular support bases that would theoretically resist any attempts to separate these groups from Iranian backing. Training programs brought thousands of proxy fighters to Iran over the years, creating personal bonds that transcended mere business relationships. These fighters learned Iranian tactical doctrines, met Iranian commanders, and developed emotional connections to Iran's revolutionary ideology. They returned to their home territories as advocates for maintaining Iranian alliance structures. Iran assumed these personal relationships would survive political pressures and military setbacks. The proxy network was supposed to be self-reinforcing. Success by one group would inspire others while demonstrating Iran's value as a patron. Each proxy success was meant to strengthen the entire system by proving Iran's strategic vision and operational capabilities. Failure by individual groups was supposed to be impossible because other network members would provide support and compensation. Intelligence sharing represented another crucial network function. Iranian proxies provided eyes and ears across multiple countries, feeding information back to Tehran about enemy movements, local political developments, and emerging threats. This intelligence network allowed Iran to anticipate problems and coordinate responses before enemies could gain decisive advantages. The proxy groups weren't just military assets but information-gathering operations that enhanced Iran's situational awareness across the region. But something went fundamentally wrong with this carefully constructed system. Despite decades of investment, despite personal relationships spanning generations, despite shared ideological commitments, the network began showing cracks that widened into chasms. Early warning signs appeared in 2024 when coordination between proxy groups started breaking down. Joint operations became less frequent. Intelligence sharing slowed. Response times to Iranian directives increased. Israel's October 2024 airstrike that crippled a key missile production facility in Iran demonstrated just how vulnerable the network had become. By 2025, the unthinkable had happened. Iran's calls for coordinated action were met with silence. Proxy groups that had once jumped at Tehran's slightest suggestion now ignored direct orders. The network that was supposed to guarantee Iran's survival had simply stopped responding. The question wasn't whether individual relationships had soured, but whether the entire strategic framework had become obsolete. Something had broken the bonds that Iran thought were unbreakable, and the first crack appeared in the most basic element of any relationship, the money. When the money stopped flowing, financial collapse hit Iran's proxy network with surgical precision. Proxy funding faced at least a 50 to 60% reduction due to new sanctions, transforming decades of careful relationship building into a desperate scramble for survival. The financial pipeline that sustained Iran's regional influence for decades had been cut to a trickle, and the consequences were cascading across the Middle East in ways Tehran never anticipated. The economic pressures crushing Iran's proxy funding began building throughout 2024 as international sanctions reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. Unlike previous sanctions regimes that focused on broad economic sectors, the 2024 measures specifically targeted the financial mechanisms Iran used to support proxy operations. The new sanctions program blocked both formal banking channels and Hawala money transfer systems that had moved hundreds of millions to proxy accounts across the region. Banking channels that had sustained Hezbollah operations in Lebanon suddenly dried up. Cryptocurrency networks that facilitated Houthi payments faced coordinated international shutdowns. Even the informal Hawala systems that had long evaded Western oversight found themselves under intense scrutiny and pressure. Iran's domestic economic situation made these external pressures exponentially worse. Inflation surged above 40% throughout 2024, forcing ordinary Iranians to choose between basic necessities and political support for the regime. The Iranian rial lost substantial value against the dollar, making foreign weapons purchases and proxy support payments dramatically more expensive. Tehran faced a stark choice that previous generations of Iranian leadership had never confronted: maintain domestic stability or continue funding proxy operations. The regime chose survival over influence. Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis all experienced funding shortfalls that halted new arms shipments and forced dramatic operational changes. Hamas operations in Gaza, which had relied on steady monthly payments from Iran, suddenly found themselves operating on emergency reserves by late 2024. Training programs stopped. New weapon acquisitions ceased. Even basic operational expenses like vehicle fuel and communications equipment became luxuries that Hamas leadership had to carefully ration. Hezbollah faced even more dramatic cuts. The organization's massive social service network in southern Lebanon, which had provided healthcare, education, and economic support to hundreds of thousands of Shia residents, began shutting down programs. Hezbollah-run hospitals reduced services. Schools closed early. Hezbollah's stipend cuts forced 70% of fighters to take government jobs as the organization could no longer afford to maintain its traditional patronage system. These weren't temporary belt-tightening measures, but fundamental changes to how Hezbollah operated as both a military force and social movement. The Houthis in Yemen discovered that their sophisticated naval operations required consistent funding streams that Iran could no longer provide. The drone boats and anti-ship missiles that had terrorized Red Sea shipping throughout 2023 required constant maintenance, fuel, and replacement parts. Without steady Iranian financial support, Houthi naval capabilities degraded rapidly. Operations that had once launched weekly now occurred monthly, then stopped altogether as technical failures mounted and spare parts became unavailable. Specific instances of Iranian funding failures began emerging throughout 2020 that revealed the depth of Tehran's financial crisis. Hamas leadership reportedly requested emergency funding to prepare for potential Israeli ground operations in Gaza. Iran's response was silence. Hezbollah commanders asked for funds to upgrade their missile defense systems. Again, Tehran couldn't deliver. The Houthis requested additional anti-aircraft systems to defend against coalition airstrikes. Iran offered technical advice, but no actual hardware or funding. These funding shortfalls forced proxy groups to make decisions that had been unthinkable just years earlier. Hamas began reaching out to Qatar and other Gulf states for financial support, essentially shopping for new patrons who might replace Iranian backing. Hezbollah started selling some of its Iranian-provided weapons on black markets to raise cash for basic operations. The Houthis began negotiating directly with Saudi Arabia about potential ceasefires, cutting Iran out of discussions entirely. Alternative funding sources created new dependency relationships that naturally reduced Iranian influence. When Qatar provided Hamas with emergency funding in late 2024, those payments came with conditions about how the money could be used and what operations it could support. Gulf states weren't interested in funding anti-Israeli operations, but were willing to pay for humanitarian programs and governance activities. Hamas leadership found themselves managing competing patron relationships for the first time, with Iranian and Arab funding sources pulling in different directions. The psychological impact of financial abandonment proved as damaging as the material consequences. Proxy group leaders who had spent decades building personal relationships with Iranian commanders suddenly found their calls unreturned. Meetings that had been scheduled months in advance were canceled without explanation. Iranian advisors who had embedded with proxy operations for years began quietly withdrawing, citing budget constraints and operational priorities elsewhere. Internal debates within proxy organizations intensified as Iranian funding disappeared. Younger Hamas commanders questioned whether continued loyalty to Tehran made sense when Iran couldn't provide basic operational support. Hezbollah political leaders argued that the organization's future lay in Lebanese politics rather than Iranian regional strategy. Houthi tribal leaders suggested that local Yemeni concerns should take priority over Iranian geopolitical objectives. Iranian attempts to maintain influence without providing actual funding exposed the transactional nature of relationships that Tehran had believed were based on shared ideology. Revolutionary Guard commanders offered increased training opportunities to compensate for reduced financial support, but proxy groups needed immediate operational funding more than long-term capability development. Iranian promises of future weapons deliveries couldn't replace the cash flows that kept proxy organizations functioning on a day-to-day basis. By early 2025, the pattern had become undeniable. Iran's financial crisis hadn't just reduced proxy funding temporarily, but had fundamentally severed the economic relationships that sustained Iranian regional influence. Proxy groups were operating as independent organizations, making autonomous decisions based on local rather than Iranian priorities. The financial lifeline that had connected Tehran to allied organizations across the Middle East had been cut, and neither side seemed interested in repairing the connection. But Iran's isolation extended far beyond its proxy relationships. The silence from Tehran's most important strategic partners revealed an even more devastating reality about Iran's position in the international system. Russia and China's strategic retreat. Moscow and Beijing's diplomatic calendars tell the story more clearly than any official statement could. Iran's last official high-level visit to Russia or China was over 8 months ago, marking the longest period without substantive contact since these partnerships began. The silence represents a calculated strategic retreat that would have been unthinkable just 3 years ago. Russia's abandonment of Iranian partnership reflects Moscow's brutal realization that supporting Tehran has become a luxury it can no longer afford. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has consumed Russian military resources and diplomatic capital to such an extent that Moscow simply lacks bandwidth for meaningful Middle Eastern commitments beyond protecting its own Syrian interests. The S-400 air defense systems that Iran desperately wanted never materialized because Russia needed every available unit for its own territorial defense. Russian weapon systems that once flowed to Iranian forces through Syria have been redirected to Ukrainian front lines where they serve immediate Russian survival needs rather than long-term geopolitical positioning. Military cooperation between Iran and Russia, which had expanded significantly through 2022 and early 2023, ground to a halt throughout 2024 as Russian priorities shifted decisively toward European rather than Middle Eastern theaters. Joint training exercises that had been scheduled for late 2024 were canceled without rescheduling. Russian military advisors who had been embedded with Iranian forces in Syria began withdrawing quietly in the fall of 2024. Even the drone technology sharing agreements that had been a cornerstone of Iran-Russia cooperation became inconsistent as Moscow prioritized its own drone production for Ukrainian operations over export commitments to Tehran. China's economic calculations proved even more devastating to Iranian hopes for great power backing. China's trade with Gulf neighbors rose to $200 billion in 2024 according to size data, while China-Iran bilateral trade fell to $45 billion. These economic partnerships dwarf China's reduced trade relationship with Iran, creating a stark choice for Beijing between supporting Iran's confrontational regional policies or maintaining lucrative economic relationships with Iran's Arab neighbors. The math was simple and brutal. Specific instances of Russian and Chinese abandonment began accumulating throughout 2024 in ways that revealed the depth of Tehran's isolation. Russia abstained on UN sanctions snapback in 2022, choosing neutrality over the automatic support Iran had expected. China allowed the arms embargo to lapse in October 2023 when the Security Council voted on sanctions related to Iranian proxy support, with Beijing choosing abstention over blocking the measure. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern where both nations began treating Iran as a liability rather than an asset in international forums. Behind-the-scenes diplomatic pressure from Western nations played a crucial role in accelerating this great power retreat from Iranian partnership. American and European officials made clear to both Moscow and Beijing that continued support for Iranian regional activities would complicate other bilateral relationships and potentially trigger additional sanctions targeting Russia-Iran and China-Iran economic cooperation. The message was delivered through multiple diplomatic channels throughout 2024. Supporting Iran's destabilizing activities would carry costs in other areas of great power competition that neither Russia nor China were prepared to pay. European diplomatic efforts proved particularly effective in driving wedges between Iran and its great power partners. French and German officials offered both Russia and China enhanced cooperation in specific economic sectors conditional on reduced support for Iranian regional activities. These weren't ultimatums, but carefully crafted incentive structures that made abandoning Iran more attractive than maintaining partnership. Russian energy companies receive hints about potential sanctions relief if Moscow reduced Iranian cooperation. Chinese technology firms were offered expanded European market access in exchange for limiting Iranian economic support. Iran's increasing isolation made partnership with Tehran actively counterproductive for both Russia and China in ways that fundamentally altered their cost-benefit calculations. Russian officials discovered that association with Iranian regional activities complicated Moscow's relationships with Arab nations that Russia needed for energy market cooperation and geopolitical influence. Chinese diplomats found that supporting Iranian positions in international forums damaged Beijing's carefully cultivated relationships with Gulf states that represented far more valuable economic and strategic partnerships than anything Iran could offer. Intelligence sharing arrangements that had been central to Iran-Russia-China cooperation began breaking down throughout 2024 as both nations reduced their commitment to Iranian strategic objectives. Russian satellite intelligence that had helped Iranian forces track Israeli and American military movements in the region became sporadic and then stopped entirely. Chinese cyber intelligence capabilities that had supported Iranian operations against Western targets were quietly withdrawn as Beijing calculated that such cooperation risked escalating tensions with the United States beyond acceptable levels. Economic cooperation agreements that had seemed solid just 2 years earlier began collapsing under the weight of international pressure and changed strategic priorities. The Iran-China 25-year Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed with great fanfare in 2021, saw its implementation timeline pushed back repeatedly throughout 2024 before being quietly shelved in early 2025. Russian commitments to invest in Iranian energy infrastructure similarly evaporated as Moscow redirected resources toward domestic reconstruction needs and European energy relationship repair efforts. The psychological impact of great power abandonment proved as devastating as the material consequences for Iranian strategic planning. Iranian officials who had built entire careers around managing relationships with Russia and China suddenly found their expertise irrelevant as those partnerships withered. Revolutionary Guard commanders who had assumed Russian military support would always be available had to completely revise their strategic assumptions about Iranian capabilities and limitations. Without reliable Russian arms and Chinese trade, Iran lost both its military shield and economic lifeline. The confidence that had sustained Iranian regional ambitions for decades began cracking under the weight of isolation that now included even Iran's most important international partners. But Iran's nightmare was only beginning, as the regional diplomatic landscape, the Abraham Accords 2.0 effect. Arab-Israeli normalization accelerated throughout 2024 and 2025 in ways that fundamentally rewrote Middle Eastern geopolitics and left Iran scrambling to maintain relevance. What began as the Abraham Accords in 2020 evolved into something far more comprehensive and devastating to Iranian strategic interests. The diplomatic momentum that started with UAE and Bahraini recognition of Israel accelerated into a region-wide transformation that isolated Iran more completely than any military campaign or sanctions regime ever could. Morocco's deepening ties with Israel throughout 2024 demonstrated the practical benefits of normalization that other Arab nations couldn't ignore. Moroccan-Israeli trade jumped from virtually nothing to over $200 million in bilateral commerce by late 2024, with Israeli technology companies establishing significant operations in Casablanca and Rabat. Israeli agricultural expertise helped Morocco increase crop yields by 30% in drought-affected regions, while Israeli cybersecurity firms provided critical infrastructure protection. These weren't symbolic diplomatic gestures, but concrete economic partnerships that delivered measurable benefits to ordinary Moroccan citizens. Sudan's quiet normalization with Israel accelerated throughout 2024 despite the country's internal political turmoil. Israeli humanitarian organizations provided medical supplies and technical expertise during Sudan's ongoing crisis, while Israeli agricultural consultants helped Sudanese farmers adapt to climate change impacts. The relationship developed organically through practical cooperation rather than formal diplomatic announcements, creating facts on the ground that made Iranian opposition irrelevant. Sudanese officials discovered that Israeli partnership offered immediate solutions to pressing problems, while Iranian support provided only ideological solidarity without material benefits. Saudi Arabia's continued diplomatic engagement with Israel throughout 2024 and 2025 represented the most significant blow to Iranian regional positioning. While formal diplomatic recognition remained elusive, practical cooperation between Riyadh and Jerusalem expanded dramatically across multiple sectors. Saudi and Israeli intelligence agencies coordinated counterterrorism operations targeting Iranian proxy activities in the region. Saudi businesses began exploring joint ventures with Israeli technology companies through third-party arrangements in Dubai and Bahrain. Even Saudi religious authorities began moderating their rhetoric about Israel in ways that prepared public opinion for eventual formal recognition. The economic incentives driving Arab states toward cooperation with Israel rather than confrontation became impossible to ignore by 2025. Israeli technology exports to Arab nations that had normalized relations exceeded $2 billion annually, providing everything from water desalination systems to advanced medical equipment. Israeli agricultural innovation helped Gulf states reduce food import dependency by 15% through improved crop production techniques adapted to desert climates. These partnerships created stakeholder constituencies within Arab societies that had direct economic interests in maintaining positive relationships with Israel regardless of Iranian objections. Iran's traditional narrative of Arab solidarity against Israel lost credibility as more Arab nations discovered that cooperation with Israel delivered tangible benefits while confrontation offered only continued regional instability. The Palestinian cause, which Iran had long used to justify its proxy network and regional interference, became increasingly disconnected from Arab state priorities as governments focused on economic development and domestic stability rather than ideological confrontation. Arab publics began questioning why their governments should sacrifice economic opportunities and regional peace for the sake of Iranian geopolitical objectives. Specific instances throughout 2024 revealed how Arab states were actively choosing Israeli partnerships over Iranian relationships when forced to make such decisions. When Iran requested that Jordan close its airspace to Israeli civilian flights in response to regional tensions, Jordan not only refused but expanded its aviation cooperation agreements with Israel. The UAE ignored Iranian pressure to cancel joint Israeli-Emirati military exercises, proceeding with the training programs despite threats of Iranian retaliation. Bahrain continued expanding its Israeli diplomatic presence even after Iranian proxies threatened attacks against Israeli personnel in Manama.